The champagne in my hand had gone warm and flat, much like my enthusiasm for this networking event, but I forced myself to stay another hour because the conference organizers were potential clients and I needed every translation contract I could get. The Fairmont Hotel corridor stretched before me in a symphony of glass and marble, evening sunlight filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Boston Harbor, the light turning everything golden and expensive in a way that reminded me I didn't belong in spaces like this, despite my pressed blazer and carefully applied makeup. Behind the heavy mahogany doors, the murmur of 200 business professionals discussing international markets and cross-cultural communication strategies created a dull roar that leaked into the hallway, where I'd escaped to catch my breath, my sensible heels already pinching after 3 hours of forced smiling and elevator pitches about my linguistic services. Security cameras mounted in tasteful brass fixtures tracked the corridor with red blinking eyes, and I'd noticed them earlier with the automatic awareness of someone who'd grown up in a place where surveillance meant something different, something related to checkpoints and troubles that Americans my age couldn't imagine. I was checking my phone for the 100th time, hoping for an update from the nurse I'd hired to check on Mamo twice daily, when the call came through with her name on the screen, and my stomach dropped because she never called during Boston business hours. She knew the time difference. She knew I was working. My thumb accepted the call before my brain could engage, and her voice came through thin and frightened, speaking in Irish like she always did. Like English was the language of outsiders, and only our native tongue could carry the weight of real emotion, real fear. Mamo, slow down. I can't understand you when you're crying, I said in Irish, the words flowing automatically after years of Sunday calls and summer visits, my own accent thickening with worry as I pressed the phone tighter to my ear and moved further down the corridor away from the ballroom doors. Is it your heart again? I asked, my free hand coming up to grip my opposite arm, nails digging into the fabric of my blazer as she sobbed something about chest pains and the doctor in the village being away, and Mrs. Flaherty from next door having to drive her to hospital in Cork. The familiar words of home wrapped around me like an embrace and a noose simultaneously, comfort and guilt, because I was here in this glass palace drinking flat champagne while she was alone and frightened, and I couldn't do anything. Couldn't afford the flight home, couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't afford the specialist she needed because the Irish health system was free, but slow, and the thing growing in her heart didn't care about waiting lists. I was telling her to breathe, to let Mrs. Flaherty take her to emergency, that I'd call the hospital directly and speak to the doctors when I felt it, that prickling awareness of being watched, that's either paranoia or survival instinct, depending on who's doing the watching. I turned slightly and saw him for the first time, standing perhaps 20 feet away near one of the massive windows, and my first thought was that he looked like money, the kind of money that doesn't announce itself, but simply exists, in the perfect cut of a charcoal suit and the unconscious confidence of his posture. He was younger than most of the silver-haired executives at this conference, maybe early 30s, with dark hair that was just slightly too long to be corporate, and features that would have been beautiful on a woman. But on him were something else entirely, sharp and masculine and arresting, in a way that made me forget my grandmother's crying for half a second before guilt crashed back. He'd been in conversation with two other men in equally expensive suits, but his attention had shifted completely to me, his body still angled toward his companions, but his head turned, his eyes locked on my face with an intensity that should have been rude, but instead felt calculated, purposeful. Those eyes were dark, almost black from this distance, and they tracked me with the absolute stillness of a predator that's just spotted something unexpected, something that's changed the equation of its evening. I turned my back on him, focusing on Mamo's voice, on the Irish words that tumbled out between sobs about pain and fear and not wanting to die alone, and I told her she wasn't going to die, that this was just a scare, That the doctors would give her something for the pain and run tests and she'd be fine, lies delivered in the language of truth because what else could I offer from 3,000 miles away? When I finally ended the call after making her promise to have Mrs. Flaherty text me updates, after telling her I loved her in Irish because I couldn't say it in English without my voice breaking, I stood for a moment with my forehead pressed against the cool window glass, watching the harbor below where boats cut white trails through dark water, trying to compose myself before returning to the networking hell of the ballroom. Forgive the intrusion, but it's rare to hear the old tongue spoken so purely, a voice said behind me, and the words were in Irish, flawless Irish, with a northern accent that spoke of education and careful teaching, not the stumbling attempts of American heritage seekers who'd learned a few phrases from ancestry websites. You're from the South, Cork, if I'm not mistaken. I spun around and he was closer now, close enough that I could see his eyes weren't black, but a very dark brown. Close enough to notice the shadow of stubble along his jaw, and the way his suit probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. Close enough to feel cornered, even though the corridor stretched empty in both directions. The two men he'd been speaking with were gone, disappeared as if they'd never existed, and security cameras tracked us with their blinking red eyes, but I suddenly felt more exposed than protected. I'm sorry, do I know you? I asked in English, switching languages like a shield, like speaking his words would create distance that the physical space between us didn't provide. My heart was hammering and I couldn't tell if it was residual fear from Mamo's call or something else, some instinct that recognized danger in expensive clothing. He smiled then, a slight curve of his mouth that didn't reach his eyes, and I noticed his lips were the kind that would look cruel or sensual depending on his expression, currently somewhere between both. Not yet, he said, also in English now. His accent slight, but definitely Italian, the vowels rounded in a way that made me think of Boston's North End, of the neighborhoods where my translation agency had told me not to take contracts because the businesses there didn't like outside involvement. But that's about to change. He extended his hand in a gesture that seemed courteous, but felt like a command. Dominic Torrino. I stared at his hand, at the expensive watch on his wrist, and the signet ring on his smallest finger, at the casual power in the gesture, and something in my translator's brain that collected cultural details and linguistic patterns was screaming that this was important, that his name meant something I should know. Maeve O'Sullivan, I said, taking his hand because refusing seemed more dangerous than accepting, and his grip was warm and firm and lasted a fraction too long, his thumb brushing across my knuckles in a way that could have been accident or intention. Your grandmother, he said, still holding my hand, still watching my face with that unnerving focus. Is she all right? The question in Irish about my private phone call felt like a violation, and I pulled my hand back, crossing my arms over my chest. That's none of your business, I said, hearing the defensiveness in my voice. The working-class Cork accent I'd spent years trying to soften for professional credibility, suddenly thick with stress. How much of that conversation did you hear? Enough to know you're worried? Enough to know you're far from home? Enough to know you speak Irish like someone who dreamed in it as a child, he replied. And there was something in his tone that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't cold either, something assessing. He gestured toward a quiet alcove further down the corridor, away from the ballroom doors and the theoretical safety of 200 witnesses. We need to talk privately. About what? I demanded, not moving, my phone clutched in my hand like a weapon, even though I had no idea who I'd call, what I'd say, how I'd explain that a strange man at a business conference had heard me speaking Irish and now wanted to talk privately about topics he hadn't named. About opportunity, he said, and the word hung between us like bait on a hook. About your unique skills and how they might be valuable to certain people. About compensation that could help with expensive medical treatments in private hospitals. My breath caught because how could he know about Mamo's condition, about the money I didn't have, unless he'd been listening longer than I'd realized or knew more than a casual eavesdropper should? Who are you? I whispered, and this time the question carried weight beyond his name, beyond his expensive suit and his perfect Irish, and his unsettling knowledge of my problems. He didn't answer immediately, just raised his hand in a subtle gesture that I barely registered until two men materialized from somewhere, appearing in my peripheral vision like they'd been waiting for his signal, both wearing dark suits and wireless earpieces, and expressions of professional neutrality that reminded me of security details I'd seen protecting diplomats at international events. They positioned themselves at either end of the corridor, not blocking exits exactly, but making their presence known, establishing a perimeter that suddenly made the expensive hotel hallway feel less like a public space and more like a controlled environment. "I'm someone who needs a translator," Dominic said, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that made me understand these men worked for him, that the security detail and the expensive suit and the casual confidence weren't affectation but reality, that whatever he was, it wasn't a tech investor networking at a business conference. Someone who values discretion and skill, someone who pays very well for both. The way he said it, the emphasis on discretion, and the meaningful look he gave me, made my stomach turn cold because I'd grown up in Ireland. I'd heard the stories. I knew what certain people meant when they talked about discretion and payment and valuable skills. "This was a mistake," I said, stepping backward, my shoulders hitting the window glass. "I'm just a translator. I work for an agency. I do conference materials and business documents, nothing that would interest you." He moved closer, not threatening but inexorable, closing the distance I'd tried to create. "That's exactly what interests me. Maeve O'Sullivan from Cork," he said in Irish, the language wrapping around my name like a claim. "You're exactly what I've been looking for. Now, shall we talk somewhere more private, or would you prefer to have this conversation where your networking contacts might overhear things that would make them very uncomfortable and make certain other parties very interested in you?" It wasn't a threat exactly, more a statement of fact, a laying out of options that weren't really options at all. And I realized with dawning horror that whatever I'd stumbled into by answering my grandmother's call in Irish, by speaking the old tongue in front of this dangerous, beautiful man, I couldn't stumble back out of it. The security cameras blinked their red eyes, and the harbor below reflected the dying light, and somewhere, behind the mahogany doors, 200 people discussed international business, while I stood in a marble corridor, understanding that my entire life had just pivoted on the axis of a single overheard phone call. A single language that should have been a connection to home, but had instead become a trap. The penthouse suite was the kind of beautiful that felt like a threat. All leather furniture in shades of cream and cognac, a bar cart with crystal decanters catching the dying light from floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Boston Harbor at dusk, the city spreading below us in a glitter of lights that looked like scattered diamonds from this height. Dominic had guided me here with a hand at my elbow that was polite but unyielding, one of his security men holding the elevator while the other walked ahead to clear the suite, their efficiency suggesting they'd done this countless times before with people who probably weren't as willing as I'd appeared to be. I hadn't been willing at all, had wanted to run back to the ballroom and lose myself in the crowd of business professionals. But his quiet certainty that I'd follow him had been more compelling than any threat. And besides, running would have required knowing what I was running from, and I didn't. Not yet. The suite door closed behind us with a soft click that sounded like finality, and I watched through the massive windows as the harbor turned dark, boats becoming strings of lights moving across black water, while Dominic moved to the bar cart and poured something amber into 2 glasses without asking if I wanted any. "You should sit," he said, carrying both glasses to where I stood frozen near the window. And I shook my head because sitting felt like surrender, like accepting whatever was about to happen. He set one glass on the coffee table near a leather armchair, keeping the other for himself. And I noticed his movements had a careful grace that didn't match the brutality his security detail implied, like he'd been taught to move through expensive spaces without disturbing anything, without leaving evidence he'd been there. I remained standing, my arms crossed over my chest, my blazer suddenly feeling cheap in this room where everything probably cost more than I made in a month. And he didn't push, just settled into the chair opposite where he'd placed my drink and watched me with that same focused attention he'd had in the corridor, like I was a puzzle he was solving piece by piece. "You said you needed a translator," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt, and he smiled that slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I lied," he said simply. "I need you specifically, Maeve O'Sullivan. I need someone who speaks Irish like a native, who understands the culture, who can move between worlds without raising suspicion. I need someone desperate enough to take a job they shouldn't take and smart enough to understand the stakes." The casual cruelty of that assessment, the way he'd identified my desperation and planned to use it, made anger cut through my fear. "You don't know anything about me," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were false because he'd found me at this specific conference, had known I spoke Irish before I'd answered that phone call, had probably known about Mamo's condition and my financial situation before he'd ever approached me in the corridor. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know your grandmother raised you in Cork after your parents died in a car accident when you were 8, he said, and each word landed like a stone in my stomach. "I know you came to Boston on a student visa for a PhD in linguistics at Boston University, that you were 3 years into the program when your grandmother's heart condition was diagnosed and you dropped out to work full-time to pay for her care. I know you've been translating conference materials and business documents for 6 years, that you live alone in a studio apartment in Somerville that you can barely afford, that you send half your paycheck back to Ireland every month, and it's still not enough for the surgery she needs. I know you haven't been home in 4 years because you can't afford the flight. I know you speak fluent Irish, English, passable French and Spanish, and you've been trying to learn Italian from library books because you think it might make you more marketable." The litany of my life delivered in his calm voice made me feel stripped naked, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability, and everything to do with the horror of being known, being studied, being reduced to data points that someone could weaponize. "How?" I whispered, and he gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the city below. "I have resources," he said. "When I need to know something about someone, I learn it." The admission should have terrified me, but instead it clarified something, crystallized the danger I was in into sharp focus. "You're not a tech investor," I said, and it wasn't a question. He laughed then, a short sound without humor. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." He set his glass down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, and the posture made him look younger, almost vulnerable, except for the controlled power in every line of his body. "My name is Dominic Torrino," he said. "My family has been in Boston for 4 generations. We run certain businesses, control certain territories, maintain certain relationships that keep the peace in neighborhoods the police can't or won't protect. Some people call us criminals. We call ourselves businessmen." The euphemism was so thin it was insulting, and I felt my hands start to shake, my nails digging into my palms. "You're Maffia," I said, the word sounding absurd in my Irish accent, like something from a movie rather than standing in front of me in an expensive suit. He inclined his head slightly. "That's one word for it," he acknowledged. "Not one we use, but accurate enough. And before you start thinking about running or calling the police or any of the other logical responses to this situation, let me explain why you won't do any of those things." I wanted to prove him wrong, wanted to grab my phone and dial 911 and scream for help, but my feet stayed planted on the expensive carpet and my phone stayed in my pocket because some part of me, the part that had grown up in Cork during the tail end of the Troubles, that had learned early that certain people operated outside the law and the law couldn't always protect you from them, understood that running would be pointless and possibly fatal. "Talk," I said, hating how my voice shook, hating that he was right about me not running. He stood and moved to a briefcase I hadn't noticed sitting on the desk near the window, extracting a tablet that he touched a few times before handing to me. The screen showed a photo of two men in what looked like a warehouse, their faces clear despite the distance of the camera, one of them middle-aged with graying red hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent time outdoors, the other younger, darker, with the kind of cold eyes that made my skin crawl. The older man is Finn O'Malley, Dominic said, and the name meant nothing to me until he continued. He's connected to certain organizations in Ireland that used to be about politics, but are now mostly about profit. Weapons, drugs, protection rackets. He came to Boston 3 months ago. The younger man is Marco Calabrese, heir to a family that controls most of the drug trade in South Boston and has been trying to expand into our territories for years. According to intelligence my people have gathered, they're forming an alliance. He took the tablet back and swiped to another image, this one showing the same two men sitting at a table in what looked like an upscale restaurant, their heads close together in conversation. They're negotiating in Irish Gaelic, he said, and I felt my stomach drop because I understood now, understood why he needed me, why my specific skills had made me valuable to someone I never wanted to be valuable to. They think they're being clever, using a language almost no one in the American underworld speaks, assuming their conversations are secure. He swiped again, and this time the screen showed audio files, dozens of them, dated and time-stamped. We've been recording them, but we can't understand what they're saying. We need to know what they're planning, when the alliance becomes official, what the terms are, what their first move against us will be. We need a translator. He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been respect or might have been calculation. We need you. I set the tablet down on the coffee table like it was burning my hands, backing away until my shoulders hit the window glass, the cold seeping through my blazer. No, I said, absolutely not. I'm not getting involved in whatever this is. I'm not translating conversations between criminals. I'm not helping you spy on your rivals or whatever you want to call it. Find someone else. There is no one else, Dominic said calmly, not moving from where he stood near the desk. Not in Boston, not with your fluency, not with your cultural knowledge. You speak Irish like someone from Cork, the same region O'Malley is from. You'd recognize references, slang, coded language that someone who learned Irish in a classroom would miss. You're perfect for this, Maeve, which is terrible luck for you, and very good luck for me. The casual acknowledgement that my skills had doomed me made fury rise up to replace the fear. I don't care about your gang war or your territory or your business, I said, my voice rising. I'm not doing this. I'll go to the police. I'll tell them everything you've told me. He didn't look concerned, just tilted his head slightly. And tell them what exactly? That a man at a conference offered you a translation job? That he showed you photos of people having dinner? The police in this city know who I am, know what my family does, and they can't touch us because we're very careful about what can be proven. You going to them accomplishes nothing except making you a problem that needs to be solved, and trust me, you don't want to be a problem for people like me. The threat was implicit but clear, and I felt tears of rage and helplessness burning behind my eyes. So what? You're going to force me? Kidnap me and make me translate your recordings? He shook his head. I'm not going to force you to do anything, he said. I'm going to make you an offer. You translate the recordings we have, possibly attend one meeting wearing a wire if it comes to that, and in exchange, I pay you $200,000. Cash. Untraceable. Enough to pay for your grandmother's surgery at the best private hospital in Dublin, enough to cover her care for years, enough to let you breathe for the first time since you were 23 years old. The number hit me like a physical blow, so much money I couldn't even conceptualize it, more than I'd make in 5 years of translation work, enough to save Mamo's life, and have something left over, enough to change everything. The fact that he knew exactly what number would tempt me, exactly what I needed, made it feel like a trap, even as my mind was already calculating flight costs and hospital fees and imagining Mamo healthy, safe, cared for in ways I couldn't provide. No, I said again, but it sounded weaker this time, less certain. Blood money, I whispered. You're asking me to be part of whatever violence comes next, whatever people die because of the information I give you. I won't have that on my conscience. He moved then, crossing the space between us in 3 long strides, and I flinched back against the window, but he stopped just outside my personal space, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. I'm not asking you to pull a trigger, Maeve, he said quietly. Just your ears and your voice. The language your grandmother taught you, that's all I need. But you're asking me to be complicit in whatever violence comes next, I countered, my hands braced against the window glass behind me. He studied my face for a long moment. I'm asking you to help me prevent a war, he said finally. The Calabresi don't negotiate, they don't share territory, they don't believe in the old ways of maintaining balance. If this alliance with O'Malley goes through, if they get access to Irish weapons and Irish connections, they'll make a move against every family in Boston. Every business owner on the North End, every family in the neighborhoods we protect, they're all targets. People will die, Maeve. Innocent people. The shopkeeper who sells me my grandmother's favorite bread, the woman who runs the community center where kids go after school, the families who've lived in these neighborhoods for generations. The Calabresi will burn it all down to expand their empire. His voice had remained calm, but there was steel underneath, certainty and something that might have been genuine concern. And you protect them? I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. Is that what you call extortion and protection rackets and whatever else your family does? He didn't flinch, didn't justify, just held my gaze with absolute steadiness. We maintain order, he said. We keep worse things out. We make sure families can walk their streets at night, that businesses can operate without being destroyed by chaos. Is it legal? No. Is it moral by your standards? Probably not. But it's what we do, and it keeps people safe in ways the law can't or won't. My grandmother fled to America with nothing but the language and her faith, he continued, switching to Irish suddenly, the words soft and precise. She built a life from ash. She raised me speaking Irish because she said I should know where I came from, what it meant to fight for your people, to protect your own. I honor her by protecting what she built. You honor yours by saving her life. We're not so different, you and I. The Irish words wrapped around me like a physical touch, intimate and invasive, and I hated that they affected me, that hearing my language from his mouth made him seem less like a criminal and more like someone who understood the weight of heritage, of obligation, of loving someone so much you'd do terrible things to keep them safe. We're completely different, I said, also in Irish, refusing to let him claim that common ground. You choose this life, this violence. I'm just trying to survive. He smiled sadly. Choice is a luxury, he replied in Irish. You think I chose to be born into this family, to inherit these responsibilities? You think I wouldn't rather be a legitimate businessman, someone who doesn't need security details and encrypted phones? But this is what I am, what I was raised to be, and I make the best of it. Just like you. Make the best of translating conference materials when you should be teaching linguistics at a university, when you should be writing your dissertation instead of sending money home every month to keep your grandmother alive. We both do what we must. I closed my eyes because he was right and I hated it. Hated that circumstances had backed both of us into corners. Hated that my grandmother's failing heart had made me vulnerable to someone like him. Hated most of all that some part of me was actually considering his offer, was calculating how many years $200,000 would buy Mamo, how I could live with myself if I said yes, versus how I could live with myself if I said no and she died because I chose moral purity over her life. When I opened my eyes, he was still watching me with that patient, focused attention, like he had all the time in the world for me to reach the conclusion he'd already known I'd reach. "Show me the rest," I said tiredly. "If you're going to convince me to sell my soul, at least be thorough about it." He returned to the desk and retrieved the tablet, pulling up a series of photographs that made my stomach turn. Bodies in alleys, businesses burned to shells, families sobbing over coffins. This is what the Calabrese did 2 years ago when a smaller family tried to maintain independence in Southie, he said, his voice clinical, detached. 15 dead, including a 6-year-old girl who was in the wrong place when they firebombed a social club. The police called it gang violence and filed it away. We called it a message. He swiped to another image, a hospital room where a young woman lay unconscious, her face barely recognizable under bandages. This is what they did last month to a woman who witnessed one of their drug deals and refused to recant her testimony. She'll never walk again. They don't believe in subtlety or mercy, Maeve. They believe in total dominance, and if O'Malley gives them the weapons and connections they need, Boston will look like a war zone within 6 months. I turned away from the tablet, from the evidence of cruelty that made my translation job seem suddenly naive, like I'd been living in a different world where violence was something that happened in other places to other people. "You're trying to manipulate me," I said, but without conviction. "Maybe," he acknowledged, "but that doesn't make it less true. You can walk away, go back to your conference, pretend this conversation never happened. And in 6 months, when you see news reports about violence in Boston neighborhoods, about innocent casualties in a gang war, you can tell yourself it wasn't your responsibility, that you chose the moral high ground. Or you can help me stop it before it starts, take the money, save your grandmother, and live with the knowledge that you prevented something worse. The choice is yours, Maeve. I've given you all the information. Now you decide who you want to be." I stood there in that beautiful penthouse suite with the city glittering below and felt the weight of the decision crushing down on me, felt my grandmother's life hanging in the balance against my principles, felt the terrible understanding that there was no good choice here, only degrees of compromise, only the question of which sin I could live with and which one would destroy me. I didn't sleep that night, just lay in my narrow bed in my studio apartment, staring at the ceiling while the refrigerator hummed and my neighbor's television murmured through the thin walls, my mind circling endlessly around Dominic's offer and those photographs of violence and the impossible amount of money that could save Mamo's life. At 3 in the morning I called Cork, knowing it would be 8 there, that Mama would be awake and having her breakfast tea, and when she answered with her voice thin and breathless from the effort of crossing her tiny kitchen, I almost told her everything, almost confessed what I was considering, and begged her to tell me what to do. But instead I asked about her doctor's appointments and the weather, and whether Mrs. Kearney next door was still bringing her groceries, and she told me not to worry in that way. That meant she was worried herself, that her heart was worse and she was trying to hide it from me. And after we hung up, I sat on my bathroom floor and cried until my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw because I already knew what I was going to do, had known since the moment Dominic showed me that number, since I'd heard the exhaustion in Mamo's voice, and done the math on how many more months she had without intervention. At dawn, I texted the number Dominic had given me, just 3 words, "The recordings only," and his reply came within minutes despite the early hour. "Address attached. Come at noon. Come alone." The restaurant was in the North End, tucked between a bakery and a travel agency on a narrow street that smelled like fresh bread and espresso. The kind of neighborhood where old Italian men sat on stoops reading newspapers and women called to each other from windows in rapid-fire Italian that my ears couldn't quite follow. The sign above the door said Torrino's, in elegant script, and through the windows I could see white tablecloths and dark wood and the soft glow of wall sconces, beautiful and intimate and completely empty, a handwritten sign on the door reading, "Closed for private event," despite it being lunch hour on a Wednesday when restaurants should be full. I stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, my hand on the door handle, giving myself one last chance to turn around and walk away and pretend this had never happened. But then the door opened from inside, and one of Dominic's security men, the same one from the hotel, built like a brick wall with watchful eyes, gestured for me to enter, and the moment for turning back evaporated like morning fog. The interior was even more beautiful than it had looked through the windows, all exposed brick and warm. Lighting and tables set with wine glasses that caught the light like small prisms. But it was the silence that struck me. The absence of kitchen noise or conversation, or any sound except my footsteps on hardwood floors. The security man, he hadn't introduced himself and I didn't ask, led me through the dining room toward a door at the back marked private, and I noticed other men positioned around the restaurant, two near the front windows, one by the kitchen entrance, all of them wearing the same dark suits and watchful expressions, all of them armed if the slight bulges under their jackets were any indication. This is insane, I thought, following a mobster's guard through a locked-down restaurant to translate conversations between criminals. This is how people disappear, how they end up as cautionary tales. But I kept walking because $200,000, because Mamo's breathless voice, because I'd already made my choice in that penthouse suite, even if I'd pretended otherwise for a few hours. The back office was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled walls covered with framed photographs, and a large desk cluttered with papers and a laptop, Venetian blinds filtering afternoon sunlight into strips that fell across the leather chair where Dominic sat. Jacket off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, looking less like a crime boss and more like any businessman working through lunch. He stood when I entered, a gesture of courtesy that seemed absurd given the circumstances, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Thank you for coming," he said, formal and careful. "I wasn't sure you would." "I didn't have much choice," I replied, setting my bag on the floor, but remaining standing, needing that small assertion of control, that refusal to be completely at ease. "You made sure of that." He acknowledged this with a slight nod. "I did," he agreed, "because this is important enough that I couldn't leave it to chance or conscience. Sit, please. We have work to do." I sat finally, my eyes drawn to the photographs on the walls. Old family pictures mostly, formal portraits from decades past. But one frame in particular caught my attention. A young Dominic, maybe 10 years old, standing next to an elderly woman with white hair and sharp blue eyes, both of them in front of a small house with flowers in the windows. "Your grandmother," I said, and it wasn't a question because I could see it in the way he stood close to her in the photo, in the protective angle of her hand on his shoulder. He followed my gaze. "Nonna Siobhan," he said, using the Italian term of affection with her Irish name, the combination summarizing his dual heritage. "She died when I was 15. Taught me Irish and how to make soda bread, and that family meant everything, even when everything was complicated, especially then." The grief in his voice was old but real, and I felt an unwelcome flicker of connection, of shared understanding about loving someone who'd shaped you, who'd given you language and identity and roots in soil you'd never seen. "She would hate what you've become," I said, cruel because I needed the distance. Needed him to be a monster, rather than someone whose grandmother had taught him the same language mine had taught me, whose loss mirrored my own impending one. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Or maybe she'd understand that protection takes different forms, that sometimes loving people means doing things that keep them safe, even when those things aren't clean or simple." He pulled open a drawer and extracted a tablet and a pair of expensive headphones, setting them on the desk between us. "But we're not here to debate my grandmother's hypothetical opinions about my life choices," he continued, his voice returning to business efficiency. "We're here because you agreed to translate recordings, and I need you to start." He touched the tablet screen, and I saw a list of audio files, dozens of them, each marked with dates and times and locations. "How many?" I asked, and he scrolled through the list. 47 conversations over the past 3 months," he said. Most are short, 5 to 10 minutes, a few longer strategy sessions, all in Irish between O'Malley and his associates, sometimes including Marco Calabresi, though he doesn't speak Irish, so there's translation happening on their end too. I took the headphones, the weight of them feeling symbolic, like accepting them meant accepting everything else, crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Before I start, I said, holding his gaze, I want your promise that this ends when the translations are done. No meetings, no undercover work, nothing beyond what I agreed to, just the recordings. He studied me for a moment, something unreadable in his dark eyes. I promise I won't ask you to do anything you haven't agreed to, he said carefully. And I noticed the precise wording, the way he'd avoided promising the scenario wouldn't require more, only that he wouldn't ask for it. It would have to be enough. I put on the headphones and he started the first file, the sound of static and ambient noise filling my ears before voices emerged. Two men speaking Irish with the thick Cork accent I'd grown up with, so familiar it made my chest ache with homesickness. I closed my eyes and listened, my pen moving across the notepad he'd provided, falling into the rhythm of translation work that had sustained me for 6 years, the comfortable mental exercise of converting one language to another. The first recording was mundane, logistics about shipment timing and meeting locations, the kind of careful planning that could have been about any business except for the coded references to merchandise and distribution points that clearly meant weapons and territory. I translated steadily, my handwriting filling pages, and when the recording ended, Dominic read my notes carefully before starting the next file. We worked like this for over an hour, me translating and him reading, occasionally asking questions about specific phrases or requesting clarification on slang I'd rendered into English approximations, and there was something almost peaceful about it, almost normal, like we were just colleagues working on a project rather than criminal and unwilling accomplice planning to undermine an arms deal. The fourth recording changed everything. The voices were the same, O'Malley's rough baritone and another man's lighter tenor, but the content made my pen still on the page, made ice slide down my spine despite the warm office. The conference at the Fairmont, O'Malley's voice said in Irish, and I recognized the location, felt my heart start to pound. There was a girl there, young, dark hair, working the registration desk. She answered a call in Irish, perfect Cork accent. The other voice, interested now. One of ours? Don't know yet, O'Malley continued, but she's either with them or against us. Anyone who speaks Irish that well in Boston is either connected to our people or to the Torrinos. Dominic's grandmother was from Cork. He was raised speaking it. Could be a plant, could be a coincidence. Find out which. My hand was shaking so badly, I had to set the pen down, had to press my palms flat against the desk to stop the trembling. They were talking about me, had been watching me, had noticed when I'd answered Dominic's call and marked me as either asset or threat. I looked up at Dominic, and his expression had gone completely still, the professional mask dropping away to reveal something cold and dangerous underneath. Keep translating, he said quietly, but I could hear the fury in his voice, controlled but absolutely present. I need to hear all of it. I forced myself to continue, my voice unsteady as I translated. The third voice, there's a third person now, says, the girl at the Fairmont, the one who answered in Irish. She's either with them or against us. Find out which. If she's Torino's, she's useful. If she's independent, she's a liability. Either way, we need to know. The recording continued, but I couldn't focus on the words, couldn't process anything beyond the horrible understanding that I'd been noticed, categorized, targeted before Dominic had ever approached me in that corridor, that my simple act of answering a phone call in my native language had painted a target on my back that I hadn't even known was there. The recording ended, and Dominic was already moving, standing so abruptly his chair rolled backward, pulling his phone from his pocket and making a call with rapid-fire Italian that I couldn't follow except for the tone, which was absolute command. When he switched to speaking to whoever was on the other end, I caught phrases. "Close the doors," he said, and "full security protocol," and "no one moves without my authorization." And through the office door I could hear movement in the restaurant, footsteps and low voices, and the sound of locks engaging. "They were watching me?" I said when he ended the call, standing now too, my legs so unsteady, my bag clutched against my chest like a shield. "At the conference? They were there?" Dominic looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, something beyond business calculation or strategic planning, protection, fierce and uncompromising. "Sit down, Maeve," he said, and his voice had gentled slightly despite the steel underneath. "You're under my protection now. They won't touch you." "Your protection?" I heard my voice rising, hysteria creeping in at the edges. "You did this. You approached me. You made me visible. You made them notice me. And now they think I'm, what? Your spy? Your asset? I'm just a translator. I'm nobody. I shouldn't be in anyone's crosshairs." I moved toward the door, but he was faster, crossing the space between us in 2 strides and positioning himself between me and the exit, not touching me, but creating a physical barrier with his body. And I noticed again how tall he was, how solid, how absolutely immovable when he chose to be. "Listen to me," he said, and I was close enough now to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the controlled intensity radiating off him like heat. "You were already visible. They noticed you before I did, marked you as relevant before I ever spoke to you. I just confirmed what they already suspected, that you could be useful to someone. The difference is that now you're useful to me, which means you're protected by me, which means they can't touch you without starting a war they're not ready for. That's what I do, Maeve. I protect what's mine." "I'm not yours," I whispered, but the words felt hollow because in some terrible way, I was now, had become his responsibility the moment I'd accepted his offer, had placed myself under his authority and his protection, whether I wanted to acknowledge it or not. He studied my face, seeing the fear and anger and betrayal there, and something in his expression softened. In Irish, quietly enough that only I could hear, "I would sooner cut off my own hand than let harm come to you. That's the truth, whether you believe it or not." The Irish words wrapped around me like a promise, intimate and binding, and I hated how much I wanted to believe him, how much I needed to believe that someone stood between me and the violence I'd stumbled into. "Why?" I asked, also in Irish, falling back into my native language because English felt too sharp for this moment. "Why do you care what happens to me? I'm just a means to an end, just a translator you needed." He was quiet for a moment, and I saw him weighing how much truth to offer, how much of himself to reveal. "Because you answered that phone in Irish when you could have ignored it," he said finally, still in Irish, his voice low. "Because you remind me of my nonna, the way you carry your language like armor and heritage and home all at once. Because you're trying to save your grandmother the way I couldn't save mine, and I understand that desperation, that willingness to compromise everything for the people you love. Because the moment I heard you speak, I knew you were extraordinary, and extraordinary things are rare enough in this world that they're worth protecting." The confession was more than I'd expected, more intimate than the situation warranted, and I didn't know what to do with it except step back, creating distance that felt necessary, even though his body still blocked the door. "I need air," I said, switching back to English because the Irish felt too dangerous now, too much like accepting something I wasn't ready to accept. "I need to think. You need to stay here until I'm certain the perimeter is secure," he interrupted, also switching to English, his tone returning to business efficiency, though his eyes remained soft. "They were at that conference, Maeve. They saw you. They're looking for you. Until I know whether they've identified where you live, where you work, what your patterns are, You stay with me where I can guarantee your safety. The reality of the situation crashed over me like cold water. I couldn't go home, couldn't return to my tiny apartment where I lived alone with no security, no protection, no way to defend myself against people who made strangers disappear. I couldn't go back to work, couldn't stand at conference registration desks where anyone could approach me, couldn't maintain any semblance of my normal life because my normal life had been rendered impossibly dangerous by a single phone call answered in the wrong language. "You've trapped me," I said. And it wasn't an accusation so much as a statement of fact, a recognition of how completely my circumstances had changed in less than 24 hours. "I gave you an opportunity," he corrected gently. "The trap was already there, set by O'Malley when he noticed you. I just gave you the option of springing it on your own terms, with protection, with compensation, with a chance to turn a threat into an advantage." I sank back into the chair because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore, because the weight of everything was too much to process standing up. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice small and tired. "Now you finish translating the recordings," he said, sitting across from me again, his posture more relaxed now that I'd stopped trying to leave. "My people secure your apartment and collect anything you need for a few days. We set you up in a safe location, not a hotel, somewhere more private where you can work and be comfortable. We analyze what O'Malley is planning and we prepare our response. And when this is over, when the threat is neutralized, you take your money and you save your grandmother and you go back to your life." "A few days," I repeated. "You're talking about a few days." He met my eyes, honest at least in this. "Maybe a week," he admitted. "Maybe two, depending on how quickly the situation develops. But yes, temporary, not forever, just until you're safe." I looked at the tablet still sitting on the desk, at the list of recordings still waiting to be translated, at the photographs on the wall showing a young boy with his Irish grandmother, and I understood that I was already in too deep to turn back, that the only way out was through. "Fine," I said, "but I want a phone. I want to call my grandmother, tell her I'm working on a special project, that I'll be out of touch for a few days. I want her to hear from me before she starts to worry." He nodded and pulled a phone from his desk drawer, new and sealed, holding it out to me. "Encrypted," he said. "Untraceable. Use it for calls to Ireland but nothing else. No social media, no emails to friends, nothing that creates a digital trail to your location." I took the phone, the weight of it feeling like another chain, another tether to this new reality I'd stumbled into. "Thank you," I said automatically, absurdly polite given the circumstances, and he smiled slightly, that same controlled expression that never quite reached his eyes. "You're welcome," he replied. "Now finish the translation. We have work to do, and the sooner we understand what O'Malley is planning, the sooner we can end this and get you home." I put the headphones back on, picked up my pen, and returned to translating conversations between criminals in the language my grandmother had taught me while making soda bread in her Cork kitchen, the language that was supposed to be my connection to heritage and history and home, not the skill that made me valuable to the Boston underworld. But I translated anyway, filling pages with English renderings of Irish strategy sessions, because the only way out was through, because Mamo needed that surgery, because Dominic had positioned himself between me and the door in a way that felt like protection rather than imprisonment, and because some part of me, the part that had survived my parents' death and emigration and 6 years of struggling in a foreign city, understood that survival sometimes meant adapting to impossible circumstances, meant finding ways to endure even when endurance felt like betrayal. Outside the office, I could hear Dominic's men moving through the restaurant, securing exits and checking sightlines and transforming a beautiful dining room into a fortress. And I tried not to think about what it meant that I needed a fortress now, that my life had become something requiring armed guards and encrypted phones and safe houses. Instead, I focused on the voices in my headphones, on the careful work of translation, on converting Irish words into English intelligence, and I told myself this was temporary, just a week or two, just long enough to earn the money that would save Mamo's life, and then I could go back to being invisible, unimportant, safe. But as I translated O'Malley's voice discussing weapons shipments and territorial control and the Boston opening they were planning, I knew in my bones that safety was an illusion I'd lost the moment I'd answered Dominic's call, and the only question now was whether I'd survive long enough to regret it. The brownstone in Beacon Hill was nothing like I'd expected, not ostentatious or cold or decorated in the aggressive masculinity of nouveau riche criminals, but warm and lived in, exposed brick walls softened by carefully chosen art and furniture that looked comfortable rather than expensive, though I suspected everything in the house cost more than I made in a year. Dominic led me through the entrance hall where afternoon light filtered through the fanlight above the door, casting geometric patterns across hardwood floors that had been worn smooth by generations of footsteps. And I noticed details that spoke to the building's history. The original crown molding, the pocket doors between rooms, the slight unevenness of walls that had settled over a century into the Boston soil. "This is your space," he said, opening the door to a guest suite on the second floor that was larger than my entire studio apartment, decorated in soft blues and creams, with windows overlooking a small courtyard garden where I could see an Irish stone cross standing among carefully tended plants. "The bathroom is through there, closet here. My housekeeper, Mrs. Castellano, will bring you anything you need. Clothing, toiletries, whatever you want. You're not a prisoner, Maeve. You're a guest under protection." The distinction felt semantic, given that I couldn't leave, that armed men were stationed around the property, that my life had been reduced to this beautiful cage, but I didn't argue because I was too exhausted from translating and fear and the surreal horror of hearing strangers discuss me like I was merchandise to be categorized. "Thank you," I said, formal and distant, and he studied my face for a moment, as if deciding whether to push through my coldness or allow me the space to process everything that had happened. "I'll be in my study if you need anything," he said finally. "Dinner is at 7. Mrs. Castellano is making ossobuco. She'll be offended if you don't eat." He left, closing the door quietly behind him, and I stood in the center of the beautiful room, feeling utterly unmoored, disconnected from my life and my identity and any sense of what happened next. I spent the first day mostly in my room, venturing out only for meals that were served in a formal dining room where Mrs. Castellano, a tiny Italian woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and an appraising expression, presided over elaborate courses, while Dominic and I made careful conversation about nothing important, the weather and Boston architecture, and neutral topics that required no emotional investment. But I noticed that before each meal, Dominic paused, his head bowing slightly, his lips moving in what I eventually recognized as prayer in Irish, the traditional blessing his grandmother must have taught him. "Bianne a tiarna, muid fein agus na beathaseo. Bless us, O Lord, and these gifts." The quiet ritual, conducted without fanfare or explanation, revealed something about him I hadn't expected. That his faith, like his language, was genuine rather than performative, a private practice maintained despite the violence of his profession, and I didn't know whether that made him better or worse, whether praying before dinner absolved anything or simply highlighted the contradiction of a man who could order executions and then thank God for his food. On the second day, I grew restless enough to explore, slipping out of my room while Dominic was in meetings somewhere in the house, his voice occasionally drifting up the stairs in Italian conversations I couldn't follow. The brownstone revealed itself in layers: a modern kitchen with traditional copper cookware hanging from ceiling racks, a formal sitting room with family photographs showing multiple generations of Torrinos and what must have been Irish relatives from his grandmother's side, a small gym in the basement where I could hear someone working out, the rhythmic impact of fists on a heavy bag echoing through the pipes. But it was the study on the third floor that made me stop breathing, that made me forget I was supposed to be keeping my distance, maintaining my resentment at the situation I'd been forced into. The room was lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, and while some sections held what you'd expect, business texts, legal references, Italian literature, an entire wall was dedicated to Irish books, everything from contemporary novels to academic texts on Celtic history to leather-bound volumes that looked genuinely antique. I moved closer, running my fingers along the spines, reading titles in Irish and English, finding first editions of Yeats and Heaney and Nuala ní Domhnaill, critical analyses of the Ulster cycle, collections of Sean Nó's songs transcribed with musical notation. And there, in the center of the collection, was something I'd never seen outside of university archives. A complete copy of the Táin Bó Cúailnge in original Irish, the medieval epic of Cú Chulainn and Queen Medb's cattle raid, bound in tooled leather with gilt edges and the kind of reverent care that spoke to genuine value rather than decorative display. I pulled it from the shelf carefully, cradling it like the treasure it was, and I was so absorbed in examining the frontispiece that I didn't hear Dominic enter until he spoke from the doorway. "That was my grandmother's," he said, and I jumped, nearly dropping the precious volume before clutching it against my chest. She brought it from Ireland when she emigrated, carried it wrapped in cloth in the bottom of her suitcase, said it was more important than jewelry or money, that it contained the soul of her people. I turned to face him, seeing him framed in the doorway in casual clothes, dark jeans and a sweater rather than his usual suit, looking younger and less intimidating, though his presence still dominated the space. "You have the entire Táin Bó Cúailnge in original Irish," I said, stating the obvious because I didn't know what else to say, how to reconcile this evidence of genuine cultural reverence with the man who ran a criminal empire. "That's... I've never even seen a copy like this outside of museums. Most of them were destroyed or lost during the colonial period." He crossed to stand beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something subtle with cedar and citrus, and he took the book gently from my hands, opening it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "My grandmother read it to me as a child," he said, his voice softening with memory as he traced the Irish text with one finger. "Said I should know the stories of heroes and their foolish pride, how Cú Chulainn's rage and honor destroyed him in the end. She wanted me to understand that strength without wisdom leads to tragedy, that the old heroes died young and violent for glory that turned to dust. I think she was trying to warn me, even then, about the path I'd end up taking." There was something vulnerable in the admission, in the way he held the book like a relic, and I found myself responding despite my intention to maintain distance. "Did it work?" I asked quietly. "The warning?" He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Obviously not," he said, closing the book and returning it to its place on the shelf with careful precision. "But I remember the stories anyway, carry them with me. Sometimes when I'm making decisions, I think about what my nonna would say, what Cú Chulainn would do, and then I usually do something else because following the hero's path in those stories always ends in death." He turned to look at me directly. "You're angry with me," he said, "and it wasn't a question. For bringing you here, for the situation you're in. I understand that. But I need you to understand something too. This library, these books, the language she taught me, they're what keep me human. Remind me that I come from people who valued honor and family and heritage, even when my work requires me to do things that would horrify them. When I speak Irish with you, when I hear you translate those recordings, it's like my grandmother is still alive, still teaching me, still insisting I remember where I came from. You're not just a translator to me, Maeve. You're a connection to the best parts of who I am." The confession was more than I'd expected, more intimate than seemed appropriate given our circumstances, and I didn't know how to respond except to deflect, to retreat into the scholarly distance that had always protected me. "She sounds like she was extraordinary," I said, focusing on his grandmother rather than on what he'd revealed about his feelings toward me. "My mama is like that too, fierce about preserving the language, about making sure I knew the songs and stories and prayers. When my parents died and I came to live with her, she switched entirely to Irish at home, said I needed to be rooted in something solid when everything else had been torn away. He nodded, understanding without need for explanation, because his experience mirrored mine, because we'd both been shaped by elderly Irish women who'd treated language as inheritance and identity and sacred trust. We stood in the library for a while longer, talking about our grandmothers and the Ireland they'd left behind, the one that existed more in memory and myth than in the modern reality of the country. And for those minutes, I forgot to be resentful, forgot to maintain my guard. Let myself simply enjoy a conversation with someone who understood the particular weight of being the keeper of a dying language, the last generation, who spoke it fluently in families that had carried it for centuries. When Mrs. Castellano called up the stairs that dinner was ready, I followed Dominic down to the dining room feeling less like a prisoner and more like what he'd claimed I was. A guest, complicated and temporary and dangerous, but a guest nonetheless. Over the next days, we fell into an odd domesticity, sharing meals where he said his Irish prayers, and I found myself responding with my own, Go raib maith agat, adaya, as an embia seo. Thank you, God, for this food. The words automatic from childhood, from thousands of dinners at Mamo's table. We talked between translation sessions, careful conversations that revealed our lives to each other in small increments. He told me about growing up between two cultures, Italian father and Irish mother, learning to code switch between languages and expectations, becoming fluent in the kind of compartmentalization that let him pray in Irish and order violence in Italian. I told him about my parents' death in a car crash when I was 16, about leaving my PhD program in linguistics when the money ran out and the grief became too heavy, about how I'd been alone for years in a city that never quite felt like home, translating to pay rent while the research that had once excited me gathered dust in forgotten files. On the third evening, as we sat in his study, me curled in one of the leather chairs with a cup of tea, him at his desk reviewing something on his laptop, his phone rang, and I saw his expression shift, saw him answer in rapid Italian before switching to English, his tone careful and controlled. I see, he said. Yes, arrange it. Whatever they need. Price is irrelevant. He ended the call and looked at me, and something in his face made my chest tighten with preemptive dread. What is it? I asked, setting down my tea because my hands had started shaking. What's wrong? Your grandmother, he said gently. The hospital in Cork contacted my people. I'd left instructions to be informed of any changes in her condition. She had another cardiac event this morning. She's stable now, but her doctors are saying the surgery can't wait any longer. They're recommending it happen within the week or the next episode could be fatal. The room tilted, and I gripped the arms of the chair, trying to process the information, trying to calculate timelines and costs and logistics while panic clawed at my throat. A week, I repeated. I can't get her $200,000 in a week. I haven't finished the translations. I'm handling it, Dominic interrupted, standing and crossing to kneel in front of my chair, his hands covering mine on the armrests. I've already called Johns Hopkins. Dr. Elizabeth Chen is one of the best cardiac surgeons in the United States, specializes in valve replacements. She's flying to Cork tomorrow with a team and portable equipment. She'll perform the surgery at the hospital there, the one your grandmother is already in, with full support staff. The Irish surgeons will assist. Everything is arranged. I stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying, the scale of what he was offering. That's not... You can't just... That would cost more than the 200,000 flying specialists internationally, surgical teams, equipment. That's not part of our agreement. I haven't earned... The agreement was that I'd pay you to translate, he said, his voice firm but gentle, his dark eyes holding mine. It didn't specify the timeline for payment. Consider this an advance on services rendered, and services to come. Your grandmother needs surgery now, so she gets surgery now. The logistics are irrelevant. But I can't pay you back, I said. And I could hear my voice breaking, could feel tears starting to blur my vision. Not for months, maybe years. If the translations aren't enough, if you need more work from me, I don't have anything else to offer. You've already offered everything that matters, he said quietly, and he reached up to brush away a tear that had escaped down my cheek, his thumb gentle against my skin. You've given me your language, your skill, your trust, even when I didn't fully deserve it. You've reminded me why any of this matters, what I'm protecting and why. That's worth more than money, Maeve. That's worth everything. The kindness broke something in me, shattered whatever walls I'd been maintaining against the impossible situation and the dangerous man, and the feelings I'd been trying desperately not to acknowledge. I started crying in earnest then, ugly sobbing that came from somewhere deep and raw, from 3 years of terror watching Mamo decline, from the exhaustion of being alone and afraid and responsible for saving the only family I had left. Dominic pulled me from the chair and into his arms, holding me against his chest while I cried, one hand cradling the back of my head and the other wrapped around my waist, surrounding me with warmth and safety and the steady beat of his heart under my cheek. He murmured words in Irish, comfort sounds I could barely parse through my tears but recognized anyway. Ta tu sabhalte anoa. You're safe now. Ta me anseo. I'm here. Ni peth aon rud ag dochar duit. Nothing will harm you. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me crying against him and him, holding me like I was something precious rather than a complication he'd acquired through business necessity. But eventually the sobs subsided into shaky breathing, and I became aware of how close we were, how my hands had fisted in his sweater and his arms had tightened around me, how if I lifted my head, our faces would be inches apart. I should thank you, I whispered, still in Irish because English felt too sharp for this moment, too inadequate for the gratitude and confusion and other feelings tangling in my chest. Go raib mille maith agat. 1,000 thanks. For my grandmother, for everything. You didn't have to do this. P. Orm, he responded in Irish, his voice low and rough with emotion I'd never heard from him before. I had to. Ni fead fain, breath nu ort ag fulengt. I couldn't watch you suffer. Ni fead fain sasam e. I couldn't bear it. I looked up then, meeting his eyes, seeing something there that made my breath catch. Desire, yes, but also tenderness, protectiveness, a kind of desperate need that mirrored what I'd been feeling, what I'd been trying to deny. Chen fath, I asked, barely breathing. Why do you care? Ta afios agat chen fath, he said. And it was true, I did know, had known since he'd spoken Irish to me in that hotel corridor, since he'd showed me his grandmother's books, since he'd positioned himself between me and danger and claimed I was under his protection. But knowing and acknowledging were different things, and acknowledging meant crossing a line I couldn't uncross, meant admitting that something had shifted between captor and captive, between criminal and translator, between two people who should have remained strangers, but had instead become something infinitely more complicated. He lowered his head slowly, giving me time to pull away, to refuse, to retreat back into the safe distance of our professional arrangement. But I didn't move except to tilt my face up toward his, and when his lips brushed my forehead, it felt like a benediction, like a promise, like the gentlest question. I answered by rising on my toes, by closing the last small distance between us. And when he kissed me, it wasn't gentle anymore, but claiming and desperate, his hands cradling my face like I was something he'd been searching for and finally found. I kissed him back with 3 days of proximity and tension and denied attraction, with the relief of knowing Mama would be saved and the terror of what that salvation cost, with the understanding that I was falling for a man who lived in violence and could offer me nothing resembling safety or normalcy or a future that didn't end in tragedy. We broke apart, breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together, and I could feel him trembling slightly, could see that his carefully maintained control had fractured as completely as my walls. "This is a terrible idea," I whispered in English, because it was, because I knew it was, because every rational part of my brain was screaming warnings about criminals and danger and the impossibility of anything real between us. "Probably," he agreed, also in English, but his hands were still cupping my face, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones. And he looked at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. "But I'm not letting you go, Maeve. Not tonight. Maybe not ever." I should have argued, should have insisted on boundaries and professional distance and all the sensible things that would have protected my heart, but instead I kissed him again, surrendering to the connection I'd been fighting since that first moment in the hotel corridor when he'd spoken my language and made me feel seen for the first time in years. We moved to the leather couch in his study, tangling together in a way that felt both inevitable and impossible. And between kisses, he whispered, Irish endearments. A gra, my love. A store, my treasure. Mocroe, my heart. And I whispered them back, the ancient language of my grandmother becoming the language of this dangerous new intimacy. Outside the study, I could hear rain beginning to fall against the brownstone's windows, could hear Mrs. Castellano moving through the house below, could hear the distant sounds of the city beyond the walls. But in that moment, the world contracted to just us, to Irish words and shared breath and the terrible, wonderful knowledge that I'd crossed a point of no return that had nothing to do with translation or money or organized crime, and everything to do with falling in love with a man who'd promised to protect me, who'd saved my grandmother's life, who'd kissed me like I was the most precious thing he'd ever held. Tomorrow I would finish the translations, would help him plan whatever response he was preparing to O'Malley's threats, would continue navigating the impossible situation I'd stumbled into. But tonight, wrapped in Dominic's arms while rain fell on Beacon Hill and Irish prayers lingered in the air between us, I let myself believe that protection and love could coexist, that a man shaped by violence could be gentle, that the language my grandmother had taught me could be both my salvation and my undoing. I whispered, Is brea liom tu, against his lips, I love you, and when he responded, Is brea liom tu fresin, agra, I love you too, my darling, I knew that whatever came next, whatever dangers waited beyond these walls, I would face them not alone, but with someone who understood my language, my heritage, my heart. It should have terrified me, and it did, but it also felt like coming home after years of wandering, like finding the connection I'd been missing since my parents died, like the Irish stone cross in his garden, foreign and familiar all at once, transplanted but still sacred, a piece of one world surviving in another. The file was innocuous at first glance, manila folder, slightly worn, sitting on the corner of the desk in Dominic's study, where his assistant had been working earlier that afternoon, and I wouldn't have noticed it at all, except that a surveillance photo had slipped partially free, black and white image of someone walking down a Cambridge street. And I recognized the coffee shop in the background, the one near my apartment where I bought my morning tea. I moved closer without thinking, curious in the absent way you are when you see something familiar in an unexpected context, and I pulled the photo free to examine it more closely, trying to place when it had been taken, why Dominic would have surveillance of that particular block. Then I saw who was in the photograph. Me, caught mid-stride with my messenger bag over my shoulder and a paper cup in my hand, my hair pulled back and my expression distracted like I was thinking about something else entirely, completely unaware I was being watched, and my stomach dropped as understanding began to crystallize, cold and horrifying. I opened the file with shaking hands, finding more photos, me entering my building, me at the library where I sometimes worked, me at the hospital visiting Mamo during one of her early admissions. each image time-stamped and annotated with details about my routine, my habits, my vulnerabilities. There were financial records showing my debt, medical reports on my grandmother's condition that I'd never authorized anyone to access, background checks going back years, even transcripts from my abandoned PhD program. The surveillance had been comprehensive and invasive, and most damning of all, it had started 6 weeks before the hospitality conference, weeks before Dominic had supposedly noticed me by chance in that hotel corridor, weeks before everything I'd thought was spontaneous and real. The folder slipped from my hands, photographs scattering across the hardwood floor like evidence at a crime scene, and I stood there staring at the documentation of my own manipulation, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with the man who'd held me while I cried, who'd saved my grandmother's life, who'd kissed me like I mattered. Behind me, I heard the study door open and Dominic's footsteps pause, heard his sharp intake of breath as he registered what I'd found, what I was looking at, and when I turned to face him, I saw guilt flash across his features before his expression settled into something carefully neutral, controlled, the mask of the boss sliding back into place. "You knew," I said, and my voice sounded distant and strange, like it was coming from somewhere outside my body. "About my grandmother, about my debt, about everything." Before the conference, I watched him calculate responses, saw him consider and discard lies, saw the moment he decided that honesty, however damaging, was the only option left. "Yes," he said simply, closing the door behind him and moving into the study, his movements careful, like he was approaching something dangerous that might bolt. I knew. The confirmation hit like a physical blow, even though I'd already understood the truth, already knew what the photos meant. "So the meeting in the hallway," I said, needing to hear him say it, needing the full scope of the betrayal articulated clearly. "That was planned. You were looking for me specifically." He nodded, his jaw tight, his hands flexing at his sides like he wanted to reach for me, but knew better than to try. "I needed someone fluent in Irish," he said, his tone matter-of-fact in a way that made everything worse, that reduced what I'd thought was connection to simple business logistics. Someone who could handle sensitive material, who had the skills but also the need that would make them agreeable to working for me. "You were qualified. I researched you." "You researched me like I was a stock you were buying," I said, and I could hear my voice rising, could feel fury beginning to burn through the shock and hurt, like I was a resource to be acquired and deployed. "And the rest?" I gestured around the study, at the Irish books and the comfortable space where we'd spent hours talking, at the physical evidence of intimacy that now felt contaminated by calculation. The library, the prayers, the conversations about our grandmothers, was that research too? Was the kiss part of the acquisition strategy? Something flickered across his face, pain or anger or something I couldn't identify, and he stepped closer, closing the distance between us despite my obvious rage. "The surveillance was business," he said, his voice low and intense, his dark eyes holding mine. "I won't apologize for that because it's what I do, how I operate, how I've survived in this world. I investigate everyone who enters my sphere, assess their usefulness and their risks. That's not personal, Maeve. That's professional necessity. But everything after the conference, everything in this house, every conversation, every moment we've shared, that was something else. That was real." "I don't believe you," I said. But even as I spoke, I could feel doubt creeping in because I'd seen his face when he'd arranged for my grandmother's surgery, had felt him tremble when he'd kissed me, had heard genuine emotion in his voice when he'd whispered Irish endearments. But I couldn't trust those observations anymore because if he'd calculated the initial approach, what else had been performance? What else had been manipulation designed to secure my cooperation? "You're very good at this," I said bitterly, "at making people feel seen and valued and important. Is that in the file too? Recommended emotional manipulation techniques for vulnerable targets?" Now he did reach for me, gripping my shoulders, and I could feel the tension in his hands, the barely controlled intensity that suggested his famous control was fracturing. "I didn't manipulate your emotions," he said, almost angry now, almost desperate. I didn't have to because what happened between us wasn't planned, wasn't something I factored into any strategy. Yes, I identified you as a resource. Yes, I orchestrated the meeting, but I didn't expect to care about you, Maeve. I didn't expect you to matter. But I don't know if that's true, I said, pulling away from his grip, from the heat of his hands and the persuasiveness of his proximity. I don't know what's real and what's strategy, and I can't stay here not knowing, not wondering if every word and touch and gesture is calculated. So let me go. Give me the money you promised. Let me leave, and we'll call this what it was, a business transaction that got complicated. His expression hardened, the vulnerability I'd glimpsed disappearing behind the cold authority of the man who ran a criminal empire. I can't do that, he said flatly. Yes, you can, I insisted, moving toward the door, toward escape and air and space to think clearly away from him. We had an agreement. I translate, you pay, I leave. So honor it and let me go. Dominic moved faster than I'd expected, positioning himself between me and the door, not touching me but immovable. His body language communicating that I wasn't leaving regardless of what I wanted. I said I can't, he repeated, switching to Irish now, his accent thicker with emotion. Ni féidir liom é sina deanam, agra, toisk gombead tu marbi leistig de la. I can't do that, my love, because you'd be dead within a day. Ta afios ag O'Malley se thu anwa. O'Malley knows who you are now. Agus ta afios ag na Calabrese, go bafuil tu liomsa. And the Calabrese know you're with me. De feat féin du scaoilead is fé dir liom and te ergiad a thabhart duit, ash pad se mar braith baiz. I could release you. I could give you the money, but it would be a death sentence. Is edushab hail techt ansio, liomsa, sibe and fé dir liat mai thiunas a thabhart domno nash fé dir. Your only safety is here, with me, whether you can forgive me or not. The Irish made it harder to maintain my anger because it was the language of intimacy between us, the language we'd used for truths and tenderness, and hearing him speak it now with such raw honesty made me want to believe him, want to trust that his concern was genuine rather than possessive. But I couldn't afford to believe, couldn't afford to be wrong again. So I'm your prisoner after all, I said in English, deliberately breaking the spell of shared language. Everything you said about being a guest was a lie. This, I gestured at the brownstone, at the beautiful cage he'd constructed. This is still captivity, just with better amenities. Neil se sin fior, he said. That's not true. But he didn't move from the door, didn't offer me freedom he'd just claimed I couldn't survive. Is roga a? It's a choice. Roga idirs landail agus bas. A choice between safety and death. Agus is fuath liom go gaketh vid tu e adeanam, and I hate that you have to make it. Ashni athroid mochwid mothuchan an realtacht. But my feelings won't change the reality. Mas gaduit mise a fuathuchun, fenacht beo dean e. If you need to hate me to stay alive, do it. Ach fan beo. But stay alive. We stood in the charged silence, rain lashing the windows and thunder rumbling somewhere over the harbor, the scattered surveillance photos on the floor between us like a physical manifestation of broken trust. I could see the tension in his shoulders, could see that maintaining his position blocking the door was costing him, that every instinct was probably screaming at him to let me go if that's what I wanted because that would be the honorable thing, the thing Cuchulain would have done. But Dominic had already told me he'd learned not to follow the hero's path in those old stories. Had learned that honor without pragmatism led to young deaths and empty victories, and he was choosing my survival over my wishes regardless of how it made him look, regardless of how it poisoned what had been growing between us. You want me to stay? I said, trying to find some solid ground in the shifting reality of my situation. Fine. I'll stay, because apparently I don't have a choice. But I want something clear between us, whatever this was. I gestured at the space between our bodies, at the invisible connection that had felt so real just hours ago. It's done. I'll help with the O'Malley situation because you're right that I'm invested now, whether I want to be or not. I'll translate, I'll wear your wire, I'll do whatever is necessary to end this threat. But after? After, you give me the money. You use your resources to make sure I'm actually safe, and then we're finished. No more pretending there's something personal between us. No more manipulation. Just the business transaction this should have been from the start. I watched something die in his eyes, watched him absorb the terms I was setting, and understand that I was closing a door he'd thought remained open. Mas e sin and ruda ta wait, he said quietly, if that's what you want. And he stepped away from the door, giving me the freedom to leave the study, even though we both knew I couldn't, not with armed men stationed throughout the house and danger waiting beyond the brownstone's walls. Ach ta rud, am hein is mian liom duit a thushint. But there's one thing I want you to understand. B, an feirikas no. The surveillance was business. And plin chun boalath lit no fresin. The plan to meet you was business too. Ach gach rud eile, gach komra, gach pog, gach mothu. But everything else, every conversation, every kiss, every feeling, pise fior, it was real. Tagra agamduit, amhave, I love you, Maeve. Agus ni hionan esin agus yonram heil. And that's not the same as manipulation. Tabron ormnar trade me go raibseseo agdul tarlu. I'm sorry I didn't believe this could happen. Nar cheap me go mbath tu nios tabachtai, na an plin, didn't think you'd become more important than the plan. Achta, agus nil legheas air. Sinni, but you are, and there's no cure for that. The declaration should have moved me, should have softened the betrayal, but I couldn't let it, because if I started believing his words, I'd lose whatever emotional distance I was desperately trying to construct. I said nothing, just stared at him until he nodded slightly, accepting my silence as the rejection it was. And he moved to his desk, putting physical distance between us, giving me space to breathe. Tomorrow we'll go over the plan for the warehouse meeting, he said, his voice returning to the professional tone of earlier, the boss conducting business. My people will brief you on what to listen for, how the wire works, what signals to use if you're in danger. You'll be protected every second, Maeve. I won't let anything happen to you. I know, I said, because despite everything, despite the surveillance and the manipulation and the orchestrated meeting, I did believe that he would protect me, that whatever else was true or false between us, his commitment to my safety was genuine. I just didn't know anymore if that protection came from caring or from unwillingness to lose a valuable asset he'd invested time and resources in acquiring. He looked at me like he wanted to say something else, to push back against my withdrawal, to argue that feelings and strategy could coexist. But instead, he just nodded and returned his attention to his laptop, dismissing me with the subtle shift of focus. I left the study, walking past the scattered surveillance photos I didn't bother to collect, returning to my beautiful guest suite that now felt exactly like what it was. A comfortable cell in a prison constructed by a man who'd researched my vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision. I lay awake most of the night listening to rain against the windows and replaying every interaction since the conference, trying to separate genuine moments from calculated manipulation, trying to determine if the man who'd held me while I cried was real or if that too had been performance, emotional investment designed to secure my loyalty. By morning, I'd reached no conclusions, except that I was trapped in a situation I didn't fully understand, committed to helping a man I couldn't trust, falling for someone who'd proven himself capable of elaborate deception. The only certainty was what Dominic had said in Irish. the brutal pragmatism that he'd chosen over honor. I could hate him if I needed to, could build whatever emotional walls would help me survive. But survival required staying in his protection, accepting his help, trusting that at least his self-interest would keep me alive, even if his feelings were fabricated. When I came down for breakfast, Mrs. Castellano gave me a look that suggested she'd heard the argument, or at least sensed the shift in atmosphere, and she served her elaborate meal in pointed silence, watching both of us like she was disappointed in children who'd misbehaved. Dominic said his prayers in Irish as always. Bianai a tiarna, muid fein agus na bathaseo. But I didn't respond with mine, didn't participate in the ritual that had felt sacred, and now felt like another manipulation, another way he'd used our shared language to create false intimacy. He noticed the absence. I saw pain flash across his face, but he said nothing, just continued eating while the silence stretched between us, familiar and foreign all at once. The language of strangers who'd briefly been something more, and were now retreating to the safety of distance and distrust. After breakfast, he brought me to a secure room in the basement where his technical people explained the wire I'd be wearing, the signals I'd use, the exit strategies if something went wrong, and I listened and absorbed and prepared myself for the dangerous performance ahead, all while trying not to think about the surveillance photos, about broken trust, about the impossible question of whether a man who'd calculated my recruitment could have genuinely fallen in love along the way. The only thing I knew for certain was what I'd told him the night before. After this was finished, after I'd helped him neutralize the threat and secure whatever information he needed, I was leaving. Not because I'd stopped caring, but because I couldn't bear to stay with someone I'd never fully trust, never fully believe, never know if what we had was real or simply the most elaborate manipulation of all. I told him the morning of the warehouse meeting that I was doing this for my grandmother, not for him, and I made sure my voice was cold and clear when I said it, made sure he understood that whatever intimacy we'd shared was buried under the weight of his surveillance photos and calculated recruitment. Dominic accepted this with a small nod, his expression carefully neutral, and he didn't argue or try to change my mind, just briefed me on the operation with the professional detachment of a commander preparing an asset for deployment. The wire was sophisticated, a nearly invisible device taped between my shoulder blades, transmitting everything I heard to the team positioned in vehicles surrounding the warehouse. And as the technician tested the equipment, I tried to ignore how Dominic's hand lingered on my shoulder afterwards, adjusting my jacket to ensure the wire was completely hidden, his touch gentle despite the clinical nature of the gesture. "You'll have 4 men inside posing as O'Malley's security," he said, reviewing the plan one final time. "They'll extract you at the first sign of real danger, and I'll be outside with the tactical team, listening to every word. If anything goes wrong, if you feel unsafe for even a second, you use the distress signal, and we come in immediately." I met his eyes, saw genuine concern there beneath the operational focus, and some part of me wanted to soften, wanted to acknowledge that regardless of how we'd started, he was trying to protect me now. But I couldn't afford softness, not when I was about to walk into a room with men who'd kill me without hesitation if they discovered what I was. So I just nodded and said I understood and tried to ignore how his jaw tightened like he wanted to say something more, something personal, before professional necessity silenced him. The warehouse was exactly what I'd expected, industrial and cold, high ceilings crossed with exposed pipes and harsh fluorescent lights casting everything in sickly yellow. The concrete floor stained with decades of motor oil and the air thick with the smell of metal and dust and something faintly chemical that made my throat tight. O'Malley was already there when I arrived, flanked by men I recognized from the previous meeting, and he looked at me with interest that felt predatory, assessing, like he was calculating my value and my vulnerabilities simultaneously. "So you're the translator," he said in English, his Cork accent thicker than I'd expected. "Dominic's girl who speaks the old tongue." I forced myself to meet his gaze steadily, to project confidence I didn't feel. "I'm not Dominic's anything," I said, using the cover story we'd prepared. I'm a freelance translator taking a well-paid job. What you're discussing is your business, not mine. He seemed satisfied with this, or at least willing to accept it, and he gestured toward the table where the Calabrese representatives were settling themselves. Three men in expensive suits who radiated the kind of casual menace that came from decades in organized crime, men who'd ordered deaths over dinner and never lost sleep afterwards. The meeting began with pleasantries in English, establishing terms and territories, and I translated the occasional Irish phrase O'Malley used when he wanted privacy from his Italian allies, when he was making asides to his own men about negotiating positions and acceptable compromises. The wire between my shoulders felt like it was burning. Impossible that they couldn't see it, couldn't sense the betrayal literally attached to my skin, but no one seemed suspicious. No one looked at me with anything except occasional irritation when I asked for clarification on technical terms. Then the conversation shifted, became more specific, and I heard things that made my blood freeze even as I continued translating in a steady voice. The alliance wasn't just about territory and weapons. It was about eliminating Dominic entirely, about a coordinated strike that would kill him and his key lieutenants, about dividing his empire between O'Malley and the Calabrese like he was already dead, already defeated, already nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. O'Malley leaned forward, his expression satisfied, and he said in Irish, apparently assuming the Calabrese wouldn't understand, Agus ma bion aun fad beles and kailin aistriu chayin ta afios again fawen shan bian I gakorkeg. And if there's any problem with the translator girl we know about, the old woman in Cork. Is brace maith I sin ma theastayon shrian wine wirthi. She's good leverage if we need control over her. I kept my face blank, kept translating the English portions of the conversation, but inside I was reeling because they'd found Mamo, had identified her as leverage, had threatened the one person I'd been doing all of this to protect. I could hear Dominic's voice in my earpiece, barely audible, just a whisper of static and breath, saying my name like a question, like he'd heard the threat too and was asking if I was okay, if I could continue, and I gave the smallest nod to indicate I was fine, even though I wasn't. Even though I was terrified and furious and calculating what would happen to my grandmother if this alliance succeeded, if Dominic died and I was left alone with men who'd use an elderly woman as a weapon. Then one of the Calabrese soldiers, younger than the others, with nervous energy and suspicious eyes, stood abruptly and walked around the table toward me, and I felt every muscle in my body tense as he approached. "You're sweating," he said in accented English, gesturing at my forehead where I could feel moisture gathering despite the warehouse's chill. "Why are you nervous, translator? Just translating makes you sweat like this?" I forced a laugh, tried to sound casual. "It's hot under these lights," I said, gesturing at the fluorescence overhead. And honestly, sitting in a room with this many armed men would make anyone nervous. He didn't laugh, didn't smile, just continued staring at me with that suspicious intensity. "I think we should search her," he said to his associates. "Make sure she's really just a translator. Make sure that Torrino didn't send us a spy." O'Malley started to object. "She's fine. She's just a civilian doing a job." But the Calabrese soldier was already reaching for me, already moving to pat me down, and I had maybe 3 seconds before he found the wire, before everything exploded into violence and probably my death. In that crystallized moment of panic, I made a choice that I didn't fully understand, even as I was making it, operating on instinct and desperation, and some deep conviction that despite the surveillance photos and calculated recruitment, I couldn't let Dominic die. I switched to Irish, speaking rapidly to O'Malley before the soldier could touch me, letting genuine terror make my voice shake convincingly. "Ace Liom," I said, "listen to me. Ta me anseo ag Torrino achni chun sibse a feiseail. I'm here for Torrino, but not to watch you. Ta luio chan aige taub amwig. He has an ambush outside. For armtha ag gach sli amach. Armed men at every exit. Ag fanacht leis an gikom hartha chungach duine am haru, waiting for the signal to kill everyone. Caithfid sib e alu anwa, trid an gictul, no bade sib marb. You must escape now, through the back, or you'll be dead. O'Malley's face went white, then red with fury, and he started shouting in Irish at his men to move, to get to the back exit, that this was a trap, that Torrino had betrayed them. The Calabrese couldn't understand the Irish, but they understood the panic, understood their allies were fleeing, and suddenly everyone was moving, drawing weapons, shouting questions, the careful meeting dissolving into chaos. The suspicious soldier grabbed my arm, demanding to know what I'd said, what was happening, but I twisted away and dropped to the floor as the first gunshot rang out, one of O'Malley's men firing at what he perceived as Torrino's trap, and then everything was noise and violence and terror. I heard Dominic's voice in my earpiece, no longer a whisper but a command. All teams go, go now, she's compromised, get her out. The warehouse doors burst open, tactical teams flooding in with military precision, and through the chaos I saw Dominic himself, not directing from outside like he'd said he would be, but coming through the smoke and shouting directly toward me, his weapon drawn, but his focus entirely on finding me in the mayhem. He reached me while I was still on the floor, hauled me up with one arm while firing over my head with the other, and he wrapped himself around me like a shield, absorbing the risk of bullets that were flying in every direction as O'Malley's men and the Calabrese tried to fight their way out, and Dominic's team tried to contain them. We made it to an armored vehicle outside, Dominic shoving me into the back seat and covering me with his body as the driver accelerated away from the warehouse, and I could feel him shaking, or maybe I was the one shaking, maybe we both were, as the sounds of gunfire faded behind us. He didn't let go until we reached a safe house across the city, some modest apartment that was clearly maintained as a temporary refuge, and when he finally released me, I saw blood on his shoulder, saw that he'd been hit while shielding me, though he didn't seem to notice or care. "Are you hurt?" he demanded in Italian, then switched to English when I didn't immediately respond. Maeve, and bafuil tu gortaith. Are you hurt anywhere? I shook my head, found my voice. "I'm fine," I said. "You're the one bleeding." "It's nothing," he dismissed. Then his expression shifted from concern to dawning realization as he processed what had happened. "You warned O'Malley," he said slowly. In Irish. "You told him I had an ambush waiting." I met his eyes, waiting for accusation, for anger, for the cold fury of a man whose operation I'd just destroyed. But instead, he just looked confused, almost hurt, trying to understand why I'd seemingly betrayed him. "I warned him to run," I said carefully. "I told him there was an ambush, and he fled, and in fleeing he destroyed the alliance before it could solidify. The Calabrese think he panicked, think he's unreliable. O'Malley thinks you tried to trap him. Neither of them trust each other anymore. You broke them apart by making them afraid." Dominic stared at me, processing this, and I saw the moment he understood the full scope of what I'd done, how I'd used the language he'd recruited me for, the language that was supposed to make me valuable to him, to save his life while appearing to betray him. "But why?" he said, and his voice was raw, unguarded in a way I'd never heard. "Why save me, Maeve? Why risk everything for a man you said you hated, a man who used you?" I wanted to give him a simple answer, wanted to maintain the emotional distance I'd been trying to construct since finding the surveillance photos, but I was too exhausted, too wrung out from terror and adrenaline, too honest in the aftermath of nearly dying. "Toisk go raib orm," I said in Irish, because I had to. "Toisk go raib me, marb dambead tusa marb fresin." Because I was dead if you were dead too. Ashnil se sin an firina iomlan. But that's not the whole truth. An firina nanach befead fain ligan duit basa fail. The truth is I couldn't let you die. Toas go befuil. Tuasco raib me. Because I have. Because I was. I stopped, struggling with the admission, with making myself vulnerable to someone who'd proven himself capable of manipulation. Tagra agam duit, Dominic, I finally said. I love you, Dominic. Fiu tar eis na bafiriti faoi an fairiachas, fiu nuera te astayon waim tu afuatu. Even after the facts about the surveillance, even when I want to hate you. Geltu paidrecha I de tianga mosheam hathar. You prayed in my grandmother's language. Fogtu me mar go raib me tabhachtak. You kissed me like I mattered. Agus inait egin emis nambreg. Fuar me rud egin fior. And somewhere among the lies, I found something true. Marsin tame amadan a thit ingrale quarpich. So I'm a fool who fell in love with a criminal. Achis fear liom abhethi mo amadan beona I mo bean stuama marb. But I'd rather be a living fool than a sensible dead woman. Dominic crossed the space between us before I'd finished speaking, his hands framing my face with a gentleness that contradicted the violence we'd just escaped. And when he kissed me, it tasted like smoke and blood and desperation, like a man who'd thought he might lose something precious and was only now realizing how much it mattered. Nabi idu amadan liom, he said against my mouth, then be a fool with me. Fan anseo, ni mar aistrewar no mar frio sunach. Stay here, not as a translator or a prisoner, ashmar mo, but as my... He paused, switching to English like the enormity of what he was asking required both languages. As my everything, my partner, my love, the person I pray with and fight for and can't imagine surviving without. I know how this started, Maeve. I know I calculated and manipulated and researched you like you were an acquisition. But somewhere between the surveillance photos and tonight, between business and personal, you became the thing I'd protect over territory, over power, over my own life. So stay. Choose this. Choose me. Choose us. I kissed him again instead of answering immediately. Let the kiss be my response. Let him feel in the way I held him that I was choosing exactly what he was asking for, even though it was dangerous, even though it meant accepting life in a world of violence and moral compromise, even though I'd never fully forget how we'd started. When we finally broke apart, I said in Irish, Fan feid me, I'll stay. Ach ar mother me freisin, but on my terms too. Ni peth aon ruin runda eile, no more secrets. Ni peth aon fleanana I mo schweinegan mothoiliu. No more plans involving me without my consent. Agus ma yaran tu orm rud egin adeanam. And if you ask me to do something, bed roga agam e adultu, I have the choice to refuse. And tuijantu? Do you understand? He nodded, solemn, like he was making a vow. Tuijim, he said. I understand. Agus glakayim leisin, and I accept that. Comfertith, he added. Partners. Ingach rud. In everything. We stayed at the safe house for 3 days while Dominic's people cleaned up the warehouse situation, while the alliance between O'Malley and the Calabrese disintegrated into mutual accusations and paranoia, while Dominic's position solidified in the vacuum their chaos created. I called Mamo from the safe house's secure line, and hearing her voice, stronger than it had been in months, clearly recovering well from the surgery, made tears I'd been holding back finally spill over. A store, she said. My dear. Takuma mhaith ort. You sound good? And bafwil tu sabhalte? Are you safe? Ta. I told her, yes. Agus fuair me ait. And I found a place. Fuair me duin. I found someone. Duin a labrayon ar de teanga. Someone who speaks our language. Duin a tuigan. Someone who understands. I could hear the smile in her voice when she responded. Ta a fiosagam, she said. I know, Chuala me e ido clor. I heard it in your voice. And gra, the love, and pitha nua, the new life. Bikuramach, agra. Be careful, my love. Ach bisona fresin. But be happy too. When I hung up, I found Dominic standing in the doorway, clearly having listened to at least my side of the conversation, and his expression was soft in a way I was still learning to recognize, the version of him that existed underneath the boss, underneath the calculated operator. She sounds well, he said quietly. Strong. Your grandmother. I nodded, wiping at my eyes. She is. Thanks to you. Thanks to the surgery you arranged. He shook his head slightly. Thanks to you, he corrected. You earned that money, Maeve. You risked everything for it. I just made sure the risk wasn't wasted. We returned to the brownstone the next morning, and as we entered through the courtyard, I saw Mrs. Castellano waiting with her usual elaborate breakfast, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes, knowing, assessing, clearly aware that something had shifted between us during our absence. She served the meal without comment, and Dominic said his prayers in Irish as always. Bianai, a tiarna, muid fein agus na beatha seo. And this time I responded with mine, completing the ritual we'd established, reclaiming it as something genuine rather than manipulative. After breakfast, Dominic had business to attend to, calls to make, operations to coordinate, the aftermath of the warehouse raid to manage, and he disappeared into his study with instructions to his men about security protocols and surveillance. I wandered the brownstone, relearning the space with new understanding, seeing it not as a beautiful prison, but as something I was choosing, somewhere I was deciding to build a life despite its dangers and moral compromises. In the late afternoon, I heard Dominic speaking Italian in the hallway, heard him giving commands that I'd learned meant he was establishing a security perimeter, heard the phrase that had once terrified me, Chiudete le porte, close the doors. But his tone was different now, gentler. And when I looked up, I saw him standing in the doorway of the library where I'd been reading, saw him watching me with an expression that was both possessive and tender. Chiudete le porte, he said again to his men, then added, Lasciateci. Leave us. I heard footsteps retreating, heard the distant sound of doors closing throughout the brownstone, and then it was just us, in the library's quiet, surrounded by Irish poetry and afternoon light filtering through the courtyard windows. Close the doors, I repeated in English, standing to face him. That phrase used to frighten me, used to feel like imprisonment. Dominic crossed to me, his hands settling on my waist, pulling me close. Dún na dwarse, he said in Irish. Close the doors. Chun andomhan, a shwenyail amui. To keep the world out. Chun tu, a shwenyail sabhailte. To keep you safe. Chun tu, a shwenyail liomsa. To keep you mine. Ni priosun e niosmo, he added. It's not a prison anymore. Ash teach, baile, idab hainen lin birt. But a house, a home, a place that belongs to both of us. I rose on my toes to kiss him, to seal this new understanding, this transformation of threat into promise, and against his mouth I whispered, Mo baile freisin. My home too. Mo rogha. My choice. Mo gra. My love. Outside the closed doors I could hear the city continuing, could hear distant sirens and traffic, and the ordinary sounds of a world that didn't know or care about the criminal empire being run from this elegant brownstone, about the translator who'd fallen in love with a dangerous man, about the alliance that had been broken by a woman speaking the language of her grandmother. But inside, in the library's quiet sanctuary, there was just us, two people who'd found each other through calculation and necessity, and had somehow, against all probability, transformed business into something real, surveillance into intimacy, imprisonment into choice. That evening, As the sun set over Boston Harbor and the brownstone's courtyard filled with golden light, Dominic took me to see the stone cross he'd mentioned weeks ago, the monument to his grandmother that he'd had installed in the garden. The inscription was in Irish, Go Andeana dia trocaire ara hanam, may God have mercy on her soul. And he stood beside me in silence, clearly waiting to see how I'd respond to this gesture, to this connection between his grandmother and mine, between our shared language and heritage, and the strange path that had brought us together. Pisi kosuil ledo sheam hather, dar liom, I said quietly. She was like your grandmother, I think. Laidir agus creidmhish, agus gramhar. Strong and faithful and loving. Agus bamhaith, lego raibtu sona. And she'd want you to be happy. Dominic's hand found mine, our fingers interlacing, and he pulled me close against the cooling evening air. Tame sona anwa, he said. I'm happy now. Neo sona namar ashilme adafead fen abhaith. Happier than I thought I could be. Tois gob fuair me tu, because I found you. We stood together in the gathering dusk, the stone cross casting long shadows across the courtyard, the Irish words connecting us to grandmothers who'd survived their own hardships, who'd passed down language and faith and the ability to endure, who'd somehow brought us to this moment, this place, this improbable love that had started with surveillance and calculation and had become something neither of us had planned for or expected, but both of us were choosing, fully and completely, with our eyes open and our hearts committed. Dún na duarse, Dominic whispered again, but this time it wasn't a command to his men or a promise of safety. It was simply acknowledgement that we were closing the doors on who we'd been separately and opening them on who we'd become together, two people bound by language and danger, and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches, even when it starts in the worst possible way, even when trust has to be rebuilt from broken pieces. Even when the only certainty is that choosing each other means accepting risk and uncertainty, and a future that could never be predicted from those surveillance photos that had documented my life before Dominic entered it and changed everything.